Cześć! Zapraszam Was do obejrzenia pierwszej części mojej rozmowy z Dave'em Getzem, czyli perkusistą, który znany jest przede wszystkim ze współpracy z Big Brother and the Holding Company, w którym to zespole śpiewała Janis Joplin. Dave nagrał partię perkusji na takie utwory jak m.in. Summertime, Piece of My Heart, Ball and Chain. Jak Dave Getz znalazł się w połowie lat 60. w Krakowie i z kim w tym czasie ze znanych polskich jazzmenów współpracował oraz z którym z nich się przyjaźnił, jak wspomina współpracę z niedawno zmarłym Country Joe McDonaldem oraz jak wyglądała kontynuacja zespołu Big Brother and the Holding Company po odejściu Janis Joplin. Tego wszystkiego dowiecie się z pierwszej części mojej rozmowy z Dave'em Getzem, na którą Was serdecznie zapraszam. Zachęcam Was również do subskrybowania mojego kanału, dzięki czemu będziecie na bieżąco z kolejnymi wywiadami, które już niebawem się na nim ukażą. A tymczasem zapraszam Was na wywiad. Przed Wami Dave Getz.
We talk about your period that you spent in Poland in the middle of 60s. And you said that it made a big impact on your career, on your further career, on your you decide then to play drum because previously you wasn't very convinced to this, but after the 1 year in Poland, in Krakow, you decided to continue with music. But how you can describe this period?
When I went to Poland, I was living in Krakowie, and I was painting. And I had a studio at the sztuk in Krakow. And as the year went on, you have to understand, I'm sure you do understand, that in 1964, Poland was a communist country, and it was Gomulka was the president or premier. And the art institute, Akademia Sztuk was wow. It's hard to explain, but they started to put people into the room with me, the people who ran the school. So suddenly, instead of having my own room, there was 2 other people. Then there were 4 other people. Then there were 7 other people. Then all of a sudden there were like 8 or 9 other people in this room with me, students that they put in with me. And I was supposed to have my own space. So it became very crowded. And I decided I wanted to get out of there. So I started to go to the jazz club in Krakow. There was a little jazz club. It was called Helicon. I didn't even remember that it was called Helicon, but someone later told me that. But I started to hang out there and just listen. And there were some good musicians. And I sat in one night. I asked if I could sit in with one of them. So I sat in, and when I sat in, then suddenly people started asking me to play with them, to be in their group or to do things. So that's what happened, is I started to play more music and less painting. I'd still painted. I still went but I didn't feel I had the room or the kind of atmosphere that I needed to work. So I did much less painting and more playing. And by the end of the time I was there, I was getting the scholarship that I had which is called a Fulbright fellowship, was something that was awarded to American students, and it was countries that owed the United States money from the Second World War. There was a plan put together by a United States senator named Fulbright. Anyway, that doesn't matter. I was getting 2,000 zloty a month. And at that time, the average worker, robotnik, in Poland was making maybe 600 or 700 zloty a month. So I was getting 200 zloty a month, and it wasn't enough. It was very little money. And I started to make money playing music. I started to travel with these different bands all over Poland. We went to Zakopane, we went to different places. I never played in Lodz, but I forget all of the cities we went to. But I started playing with different groups in Poland, and I was making money. I was probably, with my stipendium and the money that I was making, I was probably making about 4,000 zloty a month. So there was nothing. At that time it was a very hard time. I think Poland was really suffering, and you would go to grocery stores and buy food, and there would be, like, bread and onions and cabbage and just a few things, eggs, and the best food in Poland at that time was the pastry shops. Ciastko was, like, really great. There was good bakery shops, but for meat you couldn't get meat, and most of the restaurants, there were like things like privatnis that people had in their house, where they would serve people, because a lot of the restaurants, you couldn't get really good food. And I don't know where people would say that the high party officials at that time got all the good meat, or whatever, how it worked. The system was very, like, bureaucratic, and it was really fucked up. It was really like a fucked up communist socialist system, And anyway, I had a lot of money and there was nothing to buy. So mostly what I would do is take all my friends out and we would drink a lot. We would drink a lot of, vodka and eat, and and mostly I try to just spend the money I had just having fun. And then when I came back to the United States, I had mostly been playing music, and even at one point, I think I told you this, there were a lot of good jazz musicians in Poland then, but there weren't a lot of good drummers. There were just two or three really good drummers. There was Andrzej Dąbrowski, who you mentioned before, who became a singer. I guess he had a singing career. And there was a guy in Krakow. I forget what his name was, but they called him Maui. He's a little guy, and he was a very good drummer. But at one point, the Polish Jazz Quartet came to Poland, and they came to Krakow, and they were playing, and Andrzej Dąbrowski got sick. He had something happen to him, and they asked me to play with them. I was maybe the second best drummer in Krakow at that time, and I didn't even, I had just, I don't think I was even that good at that time, but I was good enough in that I had the feeling. I could play jazz, I could swing, I could do certain things that were just, got a lot of people wanted me to play with them. So that's what happened. So then I came back to the United States and I got a job teaching at the art school that I graduated from, which was the San Francisco Art Institute. And during that year, I was painting. I had a studio and I had a set of drums in my studio, but I wasn't playing with anybody. And that was the time in San Francisco, this 1965, 66, when a lot of the psychedelic thing was starting to happen. People were starting to drop LSD, take acid, and a lot of bands were starting. There was a lot of also social things like the free speech movement, what was called the free speech movement, was starting at the University of California in Berkeley. And there were just a lot of interesting things happening. There was a lot of changes happening. And, and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, this whole thing of bands, of people starting to start bands, that whole concept of what a band was starting to become very important. And so I think I wanted to get into a band, but I didn't, mostly I was a painter. And just by accident, it was just by a strange accident that I met someone who was in the band Big Brother and the Holding Company, who was the bass player, Peter. And I only met him because I had a studio where I painted. And underneath that studio was a cafe where a lot of the workers in the neighborhood ate lunch. And Peter was working in the neighborhood. He had a job in a silk screen printing place that made like T-shirts and sweatshirts with screen printing. And he was working there. And I met him and I saw this guy with long hair. in the cafe one day, and that was unusual at that time.
Mhm.
Just a few people had long hair, and so I struck up a conversation with him, and I said, asked him what he did, and he said he was in this band, Big Brother and the Holding Company. And then I went to hear them, and then we started to talk, and I said, it's a really good band, but the drummer was really weak. And that it was true that the band itself was very powerful, but the drummer didn't have any energy.
Mhm.
So I said, if you ever fire that drummer, to call me. So that's kind of what happened. I could go on and talk about it a long time, but
Yeah.
basically that's the simple things that I was painting, and my painting was I was hitting a brick wall, as they say. I was starting to run into areas in my painting where I didn't know what to go, what to do next. And at one point, the person who was the director of the San Francisco Art Institute came to my studio, and he came to my studio to look at my work and decide whether he was going to rehire me as an instructor, a painting instructor, for the next year.
Mhm.
And he looked at my work, and he knew that I was having trouble. I was having difficulty. But he asked me this question. He said, would you be doing this painting if you were on the moon? And it's a funny question because it struck me that at the time that I wouldn't be doing that particular kind of painting if I were on the moon. A lot of my painting at that time, I think I was being influenced by other people who were sort of my seniors, my mentors.
Mhm.
And I was trying to copy them. I was looking to try to find something of my own, something that was personal, but I was still copying these other painters that were influencing me, who were all about 20 years older than me.
Mhm.
And I realized that what he meant by the question, would I be doing this on the moon? He really meant, would you be doing this if you were not living in San Francisco and being influenced by these other artists?
Mhm.
Do you have something that motivates you in and of yourself that no matter where you would be, you would still want to do it? And I realized if I were on the moon, what I would like to do would be play the drums. That if I had a drum set on the moon, I would play the drums on the moon. It didn't matter whether anybody would hear me a lot because I loved playing drums, but I wouldn't be doing this painting that I was doing.
Uh-huh.
So that really changed my mind about it. And at some point, I made more of a commitment to be in this band. At that, I decided that I was going to just give myself to it, to just let myself stop painting and put it away for a while. And this was before there was Janis or any Janis Joplin. It was before she was in the band. There was just four guys in this band.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
wanted to do that. I wanted to be part of this whole new thing that was happening with psychedelic music and rock and
Mhm.
roll, and it was exciting. And I was, still painting, and I still thought in my mind, I thought, well, I'll do this band. I'll be in this band for a year or two, and see what happens, and then I'll go back and paint again. Maybe
Mhm.
something new will happen in my painting. And I didn't realize what would happen, that it would just become so much of it would take over my life and
Mhm.
really become my life for the next 13, 14 years. That's all I did really, was play the drums and be in rock and roll bands. So
Yeah, but
that's but Poland influenced me in that, it's where I really started to play again, and where really people started to say something about my playing, that they started to appreciate my playing. People started to tell me that there was something about the way I played that made them want to play with me, made them, other musicians, want to have me in their band. And it wasn't because I had the most technique or the most chops, as we say. It was something about the feel of my playing that made other musicians like it, that they wanted me in the band. I was playing with my three or four other bands in Poland by the time I left. a lot of people wanted me in their band.
Mhm.
So it was like I started to sort of see that my calling in life was maybe more playing the drums rather than painting.
Yeah, but as you said, in Poland you met a lot of jazz musicians, like you said about Andrzej Dąbrowski. Okay, the guy also Karolak, yeah, the piano
Karolak
player.
was the keyboard player, pianist in the
Yeah,
Polish Jazz Quartet.
yeah. So he
Yeah.
was also was
And
great.
a good friend of mine at the time, who was very young, was Leszek Zadlo.
Ah,
And
Jean, yeah.
Leszek then got out of Poland, and he went and he lives in Munich. I think he's still in Munich, but he was somebody that was a close friend of mine. And when I left Poland, I had a whole record collection. I had a fantastic record collection, mostly jazz, almost all jazz records, bebop and Charlie Parker and Sonny Rollins and Miles Davis and all of that. And I gave Leszek my record collection. I left it with him. And he told me years later, when I was in Munich, in the early 2000s, and I saw Leszek, and he said that when I left Poland, that his where he lived, his apartment became like a center, because at the time the only way that a lot of jazz musicians could listen to American jazz was the Voice of America. There was a Voice of America stations, and sometimes it was hard to get. Sometimes it would be blocked, or you know, you couldn't listen. But the people listened to it. But he had this now. Leszek had this fantastic record collection, which was all my records that I left with him. And he said all of the jazz musicians in Poland came to his apartment to listen to music, and that it had a big influence on Polish jazz. So it was really great to hear that in some way my leaving Krakow and leaving him my record collection, which maybe was about, I might have had like 30 or 40 LPs of mostly bebop, I would say.
Bebop was then, I think, on 30s, 50s. Yeah, there was this, of course, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, and all these guys. Have you ever met them or even see them performing, like, you know, Billie Holiday? I don't know, Miles
Oh no, I
Davis, of
never saw
course, yeah.
Billie Holiday. The people that I saw Coltrane perform when I was back in San Francisco in the early '60s. I worked in a restaurant for a while. I had a part-time job in a restaurant, and it was in the section of San Francisco called North Beach, and there was a jazz club called the Jazz Workshop. And sometimes after work, I would go to the Jazz Workshop. So I got to see John Coltrane. I saw Art Blakey. I saw Max Roach Quintet. I saw a lot of great jazz players in the early '60s. Because it was very inexpensive. You could go late at night to the Jazz Workshop, and I think it was like maybe $2 or $3 to get in after a certain time. And you know, there was just fantastic players all the time there in San Francisco then. Also, when Big Brother was playing in the mid '60s, in '66 and '67, we had people like Charles Lloyd open for us. We had bands like the Charles Lloyd Quartet, and Keith Jarrett was the pianist in that group, and Jack DeJohnette was the drummer. And I watched all of those guys play opening for Big Brother and the Holding Company, which is crazy when I think about it now, but that's what it was. That at some of these dances in San Francisco, they would have jazz groups sometimes opening up.
I'm just wondering, Stan Getz, are you related to this saxophone player?
He's a cousin of my father. My father had an aunt who was his aunt Nellie, who was also the aunt of Stan Getz. That's all I can say. So he was probably related somewhere as a cousin, some way removed, you know, fourth or fifth cousin, something like that.
Okay.
But more to my father. he was older, you know. Stan Getz was like 30 years older than I. So, and my father was 50 years. No, my father was 40 years older than me. So my father was 40 when I was born, you know, and 38 actually. But Stan Getz was more like contemporary of my father.
Okay. But you haven't met Stan Getz, and you haven't
Never met Stan Getz. No, his
never.
son is also named David Getz. He has a son who lives in Korea, in South Korea, and who communicates with me all of the time. And he told me some funny stories about growing up with his father as being Stan Getz. So
Okay.
I know the family.
How you recall this time when you grow up in New York? What in this first period of your life, I mean, what was more important for you? That, I don't know, jazz or art, painting? It was similar, or just, you know, one was more passion than the other? It was how you can tell about this?
I started to draw and you know, just to draw when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I started to draw, and I found out that I was good at it. That it was something, you know, in school, people would say, "Oh, wow, Dave, you can really draw good." You know, draw a picture for me of a pirate ship, or draw a picture of a horse, or something like that. I could do that. Draw a picture of an Indian, and I would do that. I could draw, and so you find out when you're a kid, you find out the things that you're good at. Just like you find out the kids who are like really smart in math and science, they find that out. They have a certain kind of intelligence. And the kids who have a certain kind of artistic intelligence, you start finding that out. And that's what happened to me. I found out I wasn't good in math and science, but I was good at art, and I could sing. I could sing melodies and things like that. So I had musical intelligence. I had some kind of like musical talent and an ability that other people didn't have. So you find these things out when you're young. And then when I was 11, 12, I started to copy from comic books. I started to copy pictures from comic books. And I wanted to be an illustrator. I wanted to grow up and be a comic book artist. That was my first thing. And then I got very interested in Native American culture, and I was in. This is complicated, but and it's very strange. But I became like I became friends with someone who was an Indian whose name was Gray Owl, and he had a store in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and he sold beads and he made Indian costumes and things like that. And I started to between the time I was 11 and the time I was 14, I made Indian costumes. I got very into the crafts of beadwork and design and patterns of Indian beadwork and Native American art. And I love that. And so he had this man, Gray Owl, had a thing called the Heyoka Indian Dancers. And I joined that when I was young. And we did like Native American dancing. And we would go to schools and perform. And each person in the group had to play a drum. And the drum beat was just a very like
Clapping.
just a very simple kind of a pulse, loud, soft, you know, kind of a pulse. And I could do that easily. And everybody liked when I played the drum. That was the same kind of thing that I was tagging before. That when I played the drums, people would say, "Oh, you have natural rhythm. You're good. You play the drum and we'll dance." And sometimes I would dance and they would play the drum. It'd be not so good. So some kids in school and going to like middle school, what we call junior high school in America. At that time, some kids were starting a band, and they were friends of mine. And one kid played the saxophone and clarinet. Another kid, he played the accordion. And they were starting a band, and they said, we want you to be the drummer because we saw you play the Indian drum and you have rhythm.
Mhm.
So I just, all of a sudden I was a drummer in this band. It wasn't rock and roll. We were just playing dance music, like songs, what's called now, people call American Songbook, but songs of like the 1930s and 40s for dances for old people, like for weddings and bar mitzvahs and things like that. This is in Brooklyn in the 1950s. So, that's all of a sudden. So that was something that also that I found out that I could do. You find out when you're a kid, like I said, you find out these things that you can do that other kids can't do as well as you. Some
Mhm.
kids like sports. Some kids can throw a ball really great or hit a ball really great. Some kids play football. Some kids are like, find out they're smart in math and science. I found out that I had musical ability and I had rhythm and I could do those things. So all of a sudden, I'm 14 and I'm in a band. And they bought me a drum set. I got a drum set and I started to play. And I hadn't taken any lessons, but I could do it. I could just keep a beat. I just had that ability to do that. So then I started to take drum lessons, and my parents, paid for it. And it was, I had a drum teacher, and I would go every week to take a drum lesson. But I already, before I even had any drum lessons, I was already in a band and I could play drums. I could do different beats. I could play like a rumble and I could play a swing beat and all of the things like that.
Mhm.
But I didn't want to be a musician. I wanted to be an artist.
Mhm.
And the reason I didn't want to be a musician when I was a teenager like that was because at that time, this is before the 60s, this was in the 1950s, and musicians that I played with a lot of older guys who were very good musicians, but musicians were treated like kind of like servants. It was like you were treated as part of like the servant, what you call the servant class. So when you worked at parties or functions, you would go in and you would be treated like the cooks or like the people who served the food. The musicians were part of the help. There was no kind of prestige in being a musician. It was like
Mhm.
it was looked upon in the culture, also in the culture that I grew up in, which was a Jewish culture in New York. A lot of that kind of music was looked upon almost like your klezmer. You know
Mhm.
that word, klezmer? So it's like
Klezmer.
kind of somewhere between like a
Klezmer, yeah.
gypsy.
Yeah.
It's like a Roma kind of thing. It's like it's not a really like a thing that your parents would like more. Your parents, the Jewish parents want you to be a doctor, or they want you to be like a lawyer or a scholar or something like that. They don't want you to be a musician because a musician is like a bad life. It's like you're treated like shit and nobody respects you and you go from here to there and it's hard to make a living. So, it's not a lot of respect in being a musician. But
Mhm.
being an artist for me was much more like a kind of
Important.
going up in society, like looking at something that would give me some kind of like higher status and from the world I was coming from. So I wanted to be an artist and I love doing art. I could draw like all day long. I love to draw and I love to like paint and make pictures and all of that. So I really loved doing that. And so I didn't want the life of a musician. And it
Mhm.
wasn't until like I was in my mid 20s and in a place like Poland, where all of a sudden people said, "Well, you're great at this, We want you to play with us again." So it was like I had to like make a mental change in my life. I had to
Mhm.
sort of like accept the fact that maybe I wasn't meant to make it as an artist, but
Mhm.
more like that my calling was more me in music. It was more
Mhm.
natural for me in
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
way. Even
Mhm.
though
Mhm.
I wanted the acceptance, I wanted the success as an artist more so than music. Music came like easy to me in some way,
Yeah.
and art was something that I really like I had to work at. And I really, so anyway, that's kind of the story of my life. I've always been tossed between those two things in my life. I've always still wanted to do art and wanted to achieve success in art, but it's been much harder for me to achieve success in art, whereas music just came like very naturally. I didn't work at it as hard, but it came much more easily,
But I think it's connected because you use your, imagination. Imagination is wider when you also draw, when you paint, and when you play drums. It's also somehow connected because you use, like as I said, imagination, and you are, you know what I mean, yeah? It's connected.
Yeah. Well,
anyway.
someone just this last month, there was a place in near where I live, a town where I live called Mill Valley, and they have a center for art there. And they asked me if I would be the jury for an art show, and the art show was called Seeing Music. And they asked me if I would be the jury because they knew me as a musician, but they also know that I'm an artist. So I was the jury. So I had to select the different works that went in this show called Seeing Music. And it was, trying to apply the principles of music to looking at art. And so there are a lot of things that cross over from art into music, like rhythm is one of the things. Rhythm exists both visually. There's a visual, and pattern is an idea that exists in music, and it also exists very much in art. And pattern is very important. Pattern is a very important idea in drumming because drumming is based on patterns, patterns of things repeated, ideas repeated. And same thing in rhythm is about pulse. And so these things also exist in art. But you also have things in art that also exist in music, like harmony and tone and all of that. So that's the idea that you look at art and you say, how does this art sound? How does it project music? And so that's what I was looking for.
How you remember cooperation with Country Joe and the Fish? Because when you left Big Brother and the holding company, when Janis left the band, you and Peter, I guess, joined Country Joe and the Fish. And you left this band right before Woodstock. So you haven't played on Woodstock anyway.
That's right.
But how you remember this?
Yeah.
How you remember this period when you work with Country Joe and the Fish?
Yeah. Well, it was very interesting because when Janis left Big Brother, we didn't know what we were going to do. We knew that one of the guys in Big Brother, Sam, was going with Janis. So that made Big Brother really impossible because the other guy in Big Brother, who was the other guitarist in Big Brother, he was a mess. He was using a lot of drugs and he was just not usable. We couldn't have a band with him anymore. So it was just Peter and I, and we were asked to join this other band, which was also a #1 band. It was a top band. So we went from one like #1 band to another #1 band, which was very fantastic because we had never gone to Europe with Big Brother. We had never played in Europe. And suddenly we were going to Europe with Country Joe and the Fish. And at that time, he was very, very popular because of the anti-war movement, because of his stance against the Vietnam War. And in certain places in Europe, like in Sweden and Denmark and a lot of the Scandinavian countries, there was a lot of anti-war movement and a lot of Americans who were trying to escape from going into the army. There was a thing called the draft, where like when you were 18, you would have to go into the army and then go to Vietnam. And a lot of guys said, I'm not going to go to Vietnam. I'll leave the country. So they would go to places like Sweden or Denmark, and a lot of places like that. So there was a lot of Country Joe had a lot of following in Scandinavia. He was very popular there. and also in England and Germany and France too. So we had a fabulous tour. And when we went to Scandinavia, the opening band for Country Joe and the Fish was Led Zeppelin, which is just crazy because it was Jimmy Page's, it was like a new band, and they were a phenomenal band. And they were opening for Country Joe and the Fish. Country Joe and the Fish was the headliner, and Jimmy Page's new band, Led Zeppelin. I don't even know if they were called Led Zeppelin then, but they were opening for us all through Scandinavia. So that was very strange. And we played, I also toured Europe with him again in 1973. And it was always great working with him because, for one thing, it was very good money. We made a lot of money. We made great money because he paid everybody almost equal to what he made. He was very like Country Joe McDonald is his name. Joe was very like progressive politically, very political. And so he treated the band members like equals, It wasn't like some kind of thing where someone is the leader and then I'll just pay you guys the lowest thing I can. He was very fair and everybody was treated equally, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful working for him. It was all very good arrangements. Good. We stayed in very good hotels. We, traveled in nice cars and on good airplanes. Everything was just really great working for him. In 1973, we played at a thing in France, which was the most people I ever played for. Much bigger than Monterey. It was almost as big as Woodstock, and it was called Fête Humanité, and it was put on by the Communist Party in Paris and outside of Paris. And the headliners were The Who. The Who was the headliner, but there was Miriam Makeba, the Voices of East Harlem. Eric Clapton was playing with Delaney and Bonnie, I believe. There were just a lot of really great bands on that show. It was like a festival. I think it went for 3 days outside of Paris, and there were probably about maybe 300,000 people that were there. It was huge. And so that was the most people I ever played for, was with Country Joe. So I liked working for him. It was great. And when the first time we worked for him, for Peter and I, when it was Country Joe and the Fish in 1969, we made a big mistake we quit the band because Peter and I thought that we could start Big Brother again. We were kind of, I think we were deluded. We had this idea. We had this idea in our heads that we could sort of start the Big Brother again, and that we would be like right at the top again. That we would get a new singer, and we would get another guitarist, and we would just call it Big Brother and Holding Company, and we would be right back at the top again. And we were wrong. We really miscalculated the idea. So we quit Country Joe, and then we spent the next 6 months or so auditioning different people and playing and jamming with different people, and it never got off the ground. And what finally happened, of course, was that Janis fired Sam Andrew, and he came back to San Francisco, and he decided that he would rejoin Big Brother. Peter and I would have Sam, and James, who was the lead guitarist with Big Brother, he had sort of gone through a whole lot of things, and he stopped using drugs and got a little bit better with that. And he decided he wouldn't play guitar anymore, that he would play bass, which really changed things because we could then get another guitar player who was more like, I don't know, more like something that wasn't as unique as James. James's playing was hard to fit in. It was like something that was very strange, and it didn't work anymore. It just worked in the early days of Big Brother. It was unusual, and it was very like far out, but it didn't work. It didn't work anymore. So he played bass, and we had Nick Gravenitis and Kathy McDonald and Mike Finnegan and a guy named David Shalleck played guitar. And we had all of these different people in and out for the next 2 years. We had Big Brother. And we decided very consciously, we said, we're not going to do Janis. We're not going to do the Janis material. We're going to reinvent ourselves. Again, maybe a miscalculation, maybe a mistake. I don't know, but that's what we did. We said we're going to do all new material and we're going to do a different thing and just create a whole different kind of music. So it only lasted for a couple of years. And again, then I joined with Joe again. And that was from 70 to 72. And then in 73, I played with Country Joe again. But it was called Country Joe and the All-Stars. It wasn't called Country Joe and the Fishing Rod. And we went to Europe again and we recorded at the Chateau in France. And it was always like that. Playing with Joe was always fantastic experience and good money, and everything was really, really first class. And I loved his music. I liked his music. I thought his music was meaningful, and I felt I could give my support to it and really try to do my best. It wasn't exploratory musically. It was more like being support for what his songs were and what he was trying to say as an artist. But that was good. That was okay for me, because by that time I stopped thinking of myself as just a guy in a band. And I started to think of myself more as I'm a drummer now, and I have to be able to play in lots of situations, different musical situations. I have to be able to play this kind of music. I have to be able, if someone wants to play Brazilian music, I have to be able to do that. I have to be able to not just be the drummer in Big Brother and the Hodling. So I enjoyed playing with Country Joe.
Mhm.
And that's a good question.
You know,
All your questions are good so far, because when people interview me, a lot of times people just right away go to Janis. They just want to know what Janis was like. And it's a hard thing because so much already has been written and movies made and everything about Janis. There's not much that I can really add to it. Everything's out there already.
Yeah. Yeah,
But when you talk about something like what it was like to play with Joe McDonald, Country Joe, in the early 70s or late 60s, it really is an interesting question, because he really was important during that time. That was his moment in history when he really had something to say that was relevant to what was going on in the world. So he was an important artist at that time. And so it was really great to be able to go from Big Brother, which was also a very important statement musically, and Janis and what she was doing, to suddenly go to something like that was political and social, like Country Joe, and give my support to that. It was another kind of music. So that was a very good thing for me, I thought.